Hello and welcome to the latest Science for Sport podcast. I'm your host, Matt Solomon, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Ina Janssen. So Ina has worked all over the world as a sport biomechanist. She started with studies in the USA and moved to Australia for a PhD with the Australian Institute of Sport. Now she works as a sport biomechanist at Papendal, the Dutch Olympic Training Centre, where she's done that for the last 10 years, helping elite athletes get the best out of their performances using fantastic biomechanics. So who better today to discuss biomechanics than Ina? Without further ado, it's time to welcome onto the show. So Ina, welcome to the Science of Sport podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for the invite. I've listened to quite a few of them, so it's nice to be on the other side.
Absolutely. Excellent. So can we get a quick introduction from you as to who you are and what you've been up to until now?
Yeah, sure. So I am now working as a sports biomechanist at the Olympic Training Center in Papendal, the Netherlands. I've been here for 10 years now. And I started my interest in biomechanics. I was a student athlete or a junior athlete and was injured quite a bit. So I was really interested in why I kept getting injured. So went and studied sports medicine in the US. And I followed that up with a master's in sports science in Australia. And I was lucky enough to do my PhD at the Australian Institute of Sport, where I worked with the volleyball program, looking at their issue with jumper's knee and relating that really to technique. And that's always been a big interest of mine, is how people move and what that relationship is with injury.
Absolutely excellent. So what is biomechanics then? Because obviously you've mentioned it there, like obviously how people move, but like what does it encompass? Because there's so much to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So officially it's defined as the physics of movement. So it really is how we look at athletes and how they move and how that influences performance and also the injury risk. So at the elite level, so specifically looking at sports biomechanics, we look at how an athlete moves now, what we can alter to improve their performance. So what can help them throw further, jump higher, for example, but also what their injury risk is, for example, an ACL injury or a jumper's knee, patellar tendinopathy. So trying to see how their movement influences these factors. So I really see it as a link between. Sometimes I'm more of the physio, looking at which muscles are involved in certain movements, and sometimes it's very much working with strength and conditioning as well, on how things like power and momentum can influence their technique as well.
And why are those things then important? Because it sounds kind of obvious, like injury risk, don't want those. But like, why are those important for sport performance?
Yeah, these days it's really something that is required at the elite level. It's being able to get that last few percentage and finding a way to do something more effective. Biomechanics has really moved from 20 years ago, copying someone's technique so everyone can do it the same way and win a medal, to now really identifying what this particular individual can change in their anthropometry or with their anthropometry, with their technique, and really getting the best out of them. And it's really making that difference between that last percentage to get to that point for performance.
And how does that then work at the elite level in terms of like getting someone to improve their performance? Because obviously they get to that stage because they're really good, right? So you kind of come in and you do some tests, and all of a sudden you're like, okay, well, you need to do this differently. So how can athletes use biomechanics or a biomechanist then to improve their performance?
Yeah, it's many different ways that were used. Sometimes it's indeed for the screening of the injury risk. That's probably a standard one where the whole team will come in and we'll do a drop vertical jump or different types of techniques and look at what's in everyone's injury risk. Other times it's a specific question from a coach from, hey, we want to get this athlete to throw this further. Can you have a look and maybe see what they can do differently? And sometimes the coach will say, something's not right. I don't quite know. Can you have a look at their technique and let me know what you see is differently? So those are three really different ways that approach that. And often it's just collecting the data and then having a look and seeing what's noticeable and how this athlete moves and what is maybe a reason that is holding them back or that they're unable to take that next step.
And to go about doing that, obviously you need to do some kind of testing and you have to have some equipment for that. So at the top level, at least, what are the kind of technologies which you get to use to kind of identify these things?
Well, there's a huge range. So at the really elite level and the huge sports institutes, they have really big systems, the markerless capture system that are worth a lot of money and that are now used a lot for animation, for example, with Avatar or making FIFA video games. That's exactly what they do. They'll get these athletes in and have them move, and that's why they look so much like they do in the video game. But that's not always necessary. We can also dumb it down a little bit, starting with high-speed cameras, looking at someone, how they move. Most smartphones now have 240 frames per second, so we can really slow that down, look at how someone moves. But we also use a lot of inertial sensors. So these are placed all over the body, or we can just use the lower limb to see how someone moves, and then in their environment. So they don't necessarily have to come to a lab at all. We actually don't have a sports biomechanics lab here, but that's not necessary. I'm on the BMX track, or I'm on the volleyball court, and that's where we collect the data on how they move to really get that ecological validity on what's going on there. And recently, there's been a huge development in what we call markerless motion capture. So it's really getting that three-dimensional representation of how somebody moves, and this can just be done with 2 iPads, for example, or 2 iPhones, a new system that's come out. So now we're playing with that even for, is this something we can use in the elite environments to capture what the athlete is doing without them having any markers on them, so there's no preparation time. That's really going to be really great. For example, in the US, I know a lot of the baseball stadiums have a similar system, markerless motion capture, where every pitch they can quantify the load and the technique, not only from their own players, but then also the opposition, and kind of use that as to see how people are pitching without that the players have any issues with that. So it's really taken big steps in at the elite level to quantify what people are doing. And I think every U.S. baseball team has their own biomechanists on staff now. So we've seen a huge growth in the last 10 years at the elite level.
So I imagine maybe 10 years ago or whatever, you've got these kind of markers on everyone and they're kind of suited up and they're in that little like tight lycra suit and all that kind of stuff. But potentially now you don't need any of that and you can actually just stand there. And you said 2 iPads, right? Like, yeah, how do you know that someone's not going to film you? Like, because someone could be analyzing, not me at home, but like you could be on the street, right? And people could be analyzing you.
Absolutely. And I think that that's probably already happening, unfortunately. Or with face recognition, I think that's similar as well. Really looking at how people move. I've seen some of the studies as well, is where they just look at people on the streets and how they're walking, and looking at how the different gaits can influence different people. So there's a lot of information out there that you can get without people being aware. I think with baseball, it's also just a standard. Everyone knows that this is happening in the stadiums, and that's expected. Similar things now with football. We've heard that in all the stadiums, they're getting some 3D motion analysis from every player on the pitch. And I'm sure not every player signed a waiver saying that's allowed, or they probably did and didn't know it. But it's just becoming so much data. So the trick now really is what's relevant, what's important, and what's worth feeding back to the athlete, to the coach, and what can you change, and how much focus do you need to put on certain aspects of the biomechanics to improve it.
I think it's going to be really interesting to touch on some of that later on as well. But before we get there, we touched quickly on the technology. But if, let's say, you're not in a position where you've got all of the money in the world, right? Like, brilliant if you do, you can get the most up-to-date systems. It's fantastic. Fill your stadium with these things and you can analyze everything. But let's say, you earn my salary and therefore can't do that, and you want to do some biomechanics at home. How do you go about doing that on a budget? Are there cheap options available?
Yeah, my salary doesn't allow for that either. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of apps now. So the what I was just saying with the 2 iPads, that's actually freeware and it's open source, and it comes from Stanford University. And what's really interesting, because it's open source, so many people are using it and it's free. And so the development of that is going so quickly because all these students and labs all over the world are trying it and already making gains to if it were something that you had to pay for. So that really shows on how something like that can really advance these technologies. But other apps that are available, everything from looking at your ankle function, your rehabilitation, to how high you can jump. And these have often been validated as well. And so we know with things like My Jump app, then you can see and quantify how high someone's jumping, do some even force velocity profiling with that. Golf is a huge sport where recreational weekend warriors, really film themselves and try to look at their technique to improve that. Lots of running stores have now, if you're going to buy some new running shoes, they make you run over this track just to look at how your foot moves to see what's the best type of shoe. So there's definitely lots of equipment out there and lots of apps out there to start quantifying things, which I think is great to bring it more to the mainstream. But then also the trick of what's relevant and what's important to pull out of there and how accurate are these apps. But yeah.
And I really want to get into how you do that in your work. But before we get there, if let's say someone is going to use an app like that, how do they know what the data is, which is important? How do they know how to go about processing that and improve their performance? Is there kind of a step process to that?
That's a very good question. I think there's been a few that have been validated quite well and been published that how valid they are. We always look at it a little bit. You have the validity for the academics and you have how valid it needs to be in the applied sense. And that's always a tricky, like how accurate it needs to be in order to make it effective and useful in applied. We're sometimes a little bit more lenient with what the validity needs to be. But that is something definitely to look at with the validation of that. But if someone uses these, it's mainly to compare to yourself. I think we've really moved away from this is the technique to jump or this is the technique to sprint. If you looked at Usain Bolt as a teenager, people would have said, oh, no way, this guy is way too tall, his legs are too long, he'll never be a good sprinter, because that was not the image of sprinting. So I think we've definitely moved away from the ideal movement. And it's just something to look at everyone individually and see how you can improve your technique or that specific technique for this.
Absolutely excellent. So when we're doing that in the lab, right, we're going to back to the away from cheap apps, all the equipment in the world. Can you give us an example of how you've done that previously with athletes to make sure that they're performing at the highest level or improving their performance?
Yeah, an example that I like to give, and this is actually on the running track because that's where we did a lot of the testing, and we use a system often called OptoJump in sprinting, which is great because it gives feedback right away and the athlete doesn't have any problems with it. And it basically measures how long your contact time is, how long each step is, so your step length and your air time. So I was working with a long jumper, and there's just so much information out there also internationally with world championships for athletics. They often produce a report on this are all the biomechanical variables, so takeoff velocities, horizontal, vertically. And we knew that this athlete, this is one of the examples where the coach came and said, there's something not right on this technique, can you have a look? So we tested him just with high-speed cameras, looking at what is his takeoff velocity, horizontal and vertically, and we saw that horizontal velocity was pretty comparable to the international elites and what we know that their horizontal velocity is for long jump. But when we looked at vertically, he was way behind. I think usually it's about 3 meters per second, and he was about 1.5 meters per second. So there was something in his takeoff that was really holding him back, and that's why it was really affecting his jump distance. So often these coaches, especially for long jump, you stand on the side, so what we call a sagittal view of the athletes, looked at how they're running. And what I actually did is put a camera in front, so I had the camera where the athlete was running towards the camera. And what I saw during these jumps is that when he was taking off, or when he was standing on his takeoff leg, so this was his right leg, his hips would drop, and primarily that the left leg would drop down, and that was very consistent throughout the run up, and his right leg is the one that he would take off. And knowing with biomechanics and the kinesiology, you know that there's a muscle there called your gluteus medius, which is responsible for keeping your pelvis straight when you're standing on one leg. And it was with him just so weak when he would be standing on his right leg that his hips would drop. So when he's taking off on his right leg, his hip was already dropped to the left, so we'd have to use energy to come back square and then also to get off on the ground. So we'd been really ineffective in getting off the ground, and that was really affecting his vertical velocity. So spoke with the coach about that, showing with the high-speed videos and also with the physio. And the physio then also tested the gluteus medius, and that was really weak compared to what we'd expect in a lot of the other athletes. So that was a way that we could really relate the technique and what we saw to the performance, and then back to a training. Okay, so this muscle really needs to be investigated and worked on, so we can make sure that his takeoff his vertical takeoff velocity improves. And we did that a few times also just to monitor it during training. Just we put 2 little stickers on his anterior superior iliac spine, so that 2 bones in the front, and just with sprinting, then we could keep that in an eye on what happens dynamically when he's sprinting. And it was just often feedback for him. So that was I think one of the examples where the coach really comes to something's not right. I don't quite know. Can you have a look?
And did that make a difference then in the end? Obviously, you've measured that a few times. So did you manage to make an impact?
Yeah, he did jump high. He did unfortunately do a hamstring injury jumping up when he took off the right. And the theory also actually with the physio then was because his right hamstring was had to absorb so much of the forces that were taking off because it was unable to really make that transfer with the hip muscle that was just overloaded, unfortunately. So that's often with biomechanics challenging, that you can strongly say, yes, I made a difference to this technique and this is why he jumped further. So I find that hard to pin down, but we try to contribute to a tiny aspect to that.
And I can imagine as well, when you change one thing, you change a lot of other things. So it's really difficult to say, oh yeah, this was definitely the right decision. But then when you're looking at a situation like that, is it always so obvious? So the way you described it, it sounds completely obvious, but I imagine there's sometimes you see it and it doesn't really look like anything, but then you get into the data and it's maybe a different story.
Yeah, it's an example, like you said, I've used a few times because it was one of the clear ones, and they don't definitely happen every single time. And sometimes you don't see anything different or you don't see anything unusual. But one example, I've just been working with some athletes that have had some ACL reconstructions, and we were comparing on how with the inertial sensors, how they're moving or how they're jumping in what we call the triple hop. And one of the athletes, so doing this together with physio, and they look at the landings that they stick. But one of the athletes was struggling a lot to really stick the landing. And I just kept measuring, just recording the whole session. And then I found it really interesting to go back and look, well, why is she not sticking these other landings? And then you could see that there as well, there was a lot of rotation in her trunk. She was trying to compensate for that limb. And sometimes it gives you a lot more information. You don't necessarily have to quantify it. I think you don't always have to put a number to it, but even just showing the athlete, hey, why are you doing this with your trunk? And she kept saying, oh, that's the side I'm always injured on, so I'm really worried that I'm going to injure it again if I jump on it. So with her, it was definitely psychological as well, but sometimes it's just taking the big picture instead of the actual proper test. Or when they're walking back to the start, that's where you see all these asymmetries between the left and the right limb without it being officially part of the test. So I think that's something we forget as well, that the athletes will do it when you're saying, oh, here we go, we're testing, but subconsciously or when they're not aware of when you're looking, that's when we sometimes can get a bit more information of what's really happening.
And I can imagine as well, looking back at what you've discussed with the really expensive equipment, actually everyone's got a camera. So yeah, like that could be a really reasonable way of going about things, to just take a look at it and be like, okay, what do you see? What do I see? What does the coach see? And to then come together and be like, right, okay, well, maybe you could do A, B, and C differently.
Yeah, and that's with some of the landing technique. We've done a study with handball, for example. Instead of telling them, oh, look at your landing, you need to make sure you do this with your knee or this with your hip, that we just show them an outline of their landing technique and say, just show them, don't even say anything, and let them see if they pick up themselves what they would need to change. So using a bit of the motor learning part of that, and to see if athletes can change that. So that was something that we did a few years ago, and that led to an improvement in landing technique for the injury risk.
Absolutely excellent. So, Ina, massive thanks. I really appreciate it. Where can people find a little bit more about you if they're interested in you or biomechanics?
Yeah, I'm probably most active on Twitter. So it's at Janssen Ina on Twitter. That's where I try to promote some of the biomechanics and also support of the women in science, women in sports biomechanics aspects. And that's mainly sometimes on LinkedIn. I post things as well, but I think for really biomechanics case studies and papers, that's probably the best way to find out about me.
Perfect. So thank you very much for your time and effort. I appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you on Monday.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for
Cheers.
your time.
And that's it once again. A massive thanks to Ina for all of her hard work on today's podcast. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure you do at home too. Before you leave, I want to point you in the direction of the Science of Sport Coach Academy. Now, the Coach Academy is a series of mini courses broken down into bite-sized chunks. So if you've enjoyed today's podcast and you want to get yourself into the Coach Academy, all you have to do is click that link in the show notes and you can be in there completely for free for the next 7 days in just a few seconds' time. And the bonus, every time you complete one of those courses, you'll get a certificate of completion to prove your ongoing education. And of course, if you have enjoyed today's podcast, it'd be fantastic if you recommend us to a coach, a colleague, an athlete, or a friend. That means that we can keep bringing you the best possible guests and the best possible content. And that's it. Once again, I'm Matt Solomon for Science of Sport, and I'll speak to you next week.